A call from the White House alters the course of events after a police officer attempts to remove a black woman from court. "You have to go now, ma'am." The tense courtroom rang with the officer's stern command. As whispers filtered through the audience, Theresa Marshall remained steadfast, holding on to her legal paperwork. She refused to back down and forcefully stated, "I have the right to be here." The gavel of the judge slammed. "No more, bailiff. Take her away." Then Sergeant Kyle Harrington moved forward to take her away. However, the doors to the courtroom flew open before he could touch her. A panting clerk with a folded paper hurried in. The clerk's voice faltered. "Your Honor, you have a call from the White House." A startled stillness descended upon the room. The judge paused. The cop stopped. Teresa realized then that everything was going to change. That Tuesday morning, the Shady Grove, Maryland courthouse was a whirl of nervous activity. Along the gleaming marble floors, people lined up to wait for their turn before a judge who was known for his cold glare and propensity for making snap decisions. Continuously beeping, the black metal detectors scanned each person's body and bag for the smallest indications of contraband. The structure exuded the ageless power of the justice system from the exterior. Huge wooden doors, stately columns, and an American flag flapping in the light wind. But there was a roiling pot of anxiety, stress, and despair inside. Young attorneys hurried by with briefcases pushed to their chests, files, and crumpled suits. Families huddled in corners and prayed for forgiveness in whispers. While updating records, taking phone calls, and managing human traffic, the courthouse personnel typed frantically. In the midst of the innumerable whispered arguments concerning bail, penalties, charges, and pleas, signs admonished everyone to remain silent in the hallways. Anxiety permeated the air as well, a combination of stale coffee, old paper, and sweaty trepidation. One figure stood out in the midst of all this hurried commotion. A tall, black woman in her early 40s is named Theresa Marshall. Her eyes were determined but slightly weary, and she wore a white blouse and a modest black blazer. Her hair was styled in a neat braid. Teresa spoke softly, but her presence demanded attention. From a difficult childhood to innumerable career setbacks, she has faced numerous challenges throughout her life. But it seemed heavier now. She was present to provide testimony in a legal proceeding pertaining to her own complaint alleging workplace discrimination. Teresa's day in court had finally come after she was fired from a prominent marketing company for alleged apparent bias. The scent of official polish and stress filled the corridors, akin to the subtle scent of lemon-scented cleaner that is unable to completely remove the underlying dirt. Teresa gripped her legal papers, a mixture of fear and hope. Determined to defend what she felt was right, she had prepared carefully with her lawyer. However, Teresa was unaware of the significant transformation her life was about to undergo. Sergeant Kyle Harrington, a tall, strong law enforcement officer with a sharp jawline and close-cropped hair, was tucked up in the same hallway's corner. There was an air of power about him. He was familiar with the specifics of the courthouse, but there was a hint of tightness in his posture that day. From the minute she entered the building, Teresa could see him looking at her, as though he was specifically targeting her. The hearing took place in room 306, which is renowned for Judge Marjorie Hesington's strict methods, at 9:30 a.m. Rick Stanton, her lawyer, and an idealistic middle-aged guy who has fought for civil rights, nodded his approval as Teresa slipped into the wooden benches. In sharp contrast was the marketing firm's opposing attorney. Slick hair, a pricey suit, and the self-assured look of someone who thought he had all the answers. Teresa saw Sergeant Harrington enter the courtroom before to the start of the hearing. His eyes wandered across the chairs before settling on her. There was nothing to worry about just now. Officers frequently kept an eye on events to ensure decorum. But there was a hardness in his eyes, as though he was waiting for something. Armed with an intimidating gaze and wearing a black robe, Judge Hesington came out of her chambers. The gavel slammed. They exchanged the customary formalities. Teresa felt her heart thumping in her chest. She had been anticipating this day to offer her testimony and supporting documentation. Evidence includes discriminatory emails and statistics demonstrating that, despite her superior performance, she was consistently passed over for promotions. She desired justice for the innumerable others who had been silenced by corporate machinery, in addition to herself. Tensions increased during the hearing. Slides depicting Teresa's performance reports, positive testimonials from past customers, and the sudden change in her evaluations upon the appointment of a new manager were all displayed by her attorney. One who allegedly made racist comments in private. The lawyer for the marketing agency sneered, examining every bit of information and portraying Teresa as a dissatisfied worker seeking a large settlement. Despite Teresa's passionate statement, Judge Harrington was unimpressed. The judge's gaze shifted back and forth between Teresa, the attorneys, and the screens. Teresa questioned whether Harrington had personal prejudices. Her face stayed icy. Slowly, the courtroom began to feel impatient. Teresa had the uneasy feeling that she might be up against a steep climb. Then the surprise encounter occurred. Citing fresh evidence, Teresa asked for permission to address the court once more as she completed her answer to the opposing counsel's cross-examination. The judge snapped and rolled her eyes, frustrated by how long the hearing had gone on. "I'm done, Ms. Marshall. Your time is over." The court became irate when Teresa attempted to clarify, stating again that she had important new emails that the defense had not revealed. Harrington's voice rose as I said enough. "I'll have you taken out of my courtroom if you interrupt again." Something ignited in that conversation, in Teresa's resolute refusal to be quiet. Sergeant Harrington, who had been standing close to the door, moved forward right away, seemingly seeking a reason to forcibly remove Teresa. At last, Judge Harrington lost patience. "I'm telling you to go, Ms. Marshall, because you can't follow directions," she said, pointing a finger at Teresa. The sound of her gavel slamming down again reverberated throughout the courtroom. There was a loud gasp among the few onlookers. In an attempt to defuse the tension, Rick Stanton jumped to his feet. He clarified that there was no disrespect meant for the court, that Teresa was under stress, and that the fresh evidence could change the outcome of the case. His remarks were ignored. Using the formal title for the courthouse security, Judge Harrington said, "Bailiff, take Ms. Marshall out of my courtroom now." That was Sergeant Harrington's cue. With a glance that made it clear he was more than willing to move forward, he stepped forward toward Teresa. Teresa's entire world shook. This was her opportunity to finally discuss the unfairness she had experienced in public. Her testimony could be invalidated and her evidence disregarded if she was kicked out. She was overcome with desperation. Sergeant Harrington was standing over her, handcuffs clinking menacingly at his belt, and she opened her mouth to object one last time. "You must go now, ma'am," he stated angrily. Rick touched Teresa's shoulder tenderly. "Leave," he muttered. "We'll work things out. Avoid making things worse." Teresa stood with hot tears of frustration prickling behind her eyes. She collected her documents, the painstakingly prepared proof that had suddenly lost its value. Everyone in the courtroom looked on, some sympathetically, some smugly. Her sense of injustice was heightened by the weight of the stairs. With a tight grip on her upper arm, Harrington led her to the aisle. Anger rose within her. Why did those in positions of authority always find it so simple to stifle black voices? Beneath her placid veneer, the anger bubbled. Even though she had experienced hardship before, this felt like a serious breach of the judicial system that was supposed to treat everyone fairly. With a shaky dignity, Teresa approached the double doors in silence. Even though the whole ordeal had only lasted a few minutes, it felt like a lifetime of embarrassment. Harrington's hold tightened briefly as she left, as though to make sure she understood he had her. Despite her anger, she remained silent. If she hoped to salvage her case, she had to keep her composure. She could feel the courtroom's eyes piercing her back. Teresa had no idea that the moment she stepped inside that doorway, the real war was about to start. Time slowed down. Harrington looked at Teresa sometimes while he made notes on a little notepad. That infuriated her. He seemed to be recording every movement and breath she made, as if he were gathering proof of her guilt where none was. She folded her hands in her lap and tried not to lose her cool. Sunshine streamed in as the day became brighter outside the courthouse windows. Beyond these barriers, life continued as usual, and Teresa was amazed. People were hurrying to work, breakfast, and meetings as the traffic sped by. Her world, meanwhile, seemed to have stopped completely. After a long moment, Harrington put his notes back in the pocket of his vest. He stood up straight, as if he were about to take her away. To Teresa's astonishment, he then spoke in a low voice that was a little less officious than before, but still not quite remorseful. "You've put me in a tight spot, lady. The judge ordered me to take you out. I just did what I was told." Teresa looked closely at him. She knew the explanation that marginalized people had heard countless times. "I'm simply doing my job." Reminding herself that anger may be turned against her, she fought the temptation to snap. Rather, she said coolly, "I know you have work to do, Sergeant. However, how you do it is equally important." As though his fleeting human connection vanished under the weight of authority, his face hardened once more. "You can speak with the judge if you have a problem." He turned away and remarked, "I don't make the rules." Teresa plucked up the resolve to stop him before he could go. She said, "You may be the victim of injustice one day. Recall the way you handled people when you were in a position of authority." With his back to her, he paused and went on without responding. Teresa felt a wave of sympathy, rage, and strange resolve as she watched him leave. He might have been simply another cog in the machine. However, cogs still have the power to determine how rough they turn. She got up, collecting her papers and her bruised ego. Suddenly, the hallway seemed deserted. Rick Stanton was still not there. Teresa continued to cling to the slim chance that the judge might change her mind. There were no messages on her phone when she checked it. She had no idea that mayhem was breaking out in the courtroom. Teresa might be cited for contempt. The judge and opposing counsel were debating. Rick was arguing angrily, waving the recently found proof Teresa had attempted to show. Tension was at an all-time high as heated discussions increased. Then, in the middle of all that chaos, something very unexpected occurred. Everyone's sense of normalcy will soon be disturbed by a call from Washington, D.C. Back in room 306, there was anarchy. Rick Stanton's face was crimson with rage as he stood at the plaintiff's table. He cited the recently discovered new emails, which he claimed proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Teresa's employer singled her out because of her race. If he didn't calm down, the frowning judge threatened to put him in contempt next. In an attempt to take advantage of the situation, the opposing counsel rejected the additional documents as unauthenticated or irrelevant. As confusion raged, the bailiff tried to get everything under control. Then a court clerk rushed into the chamber, making a beeline for the bench to speak in Judge Hesington's ear under duress. The judge's irritated look changed to one of surprise. The cashier handed her a folded note as she turned to face him. A deep wrinkle of her brow appeared after a moment of hesitation. She pounded the gavel for stillness while clearing her throat. Sharply, she announced, "We're going into recess. Everyone is still in the area. This court has been adjourned for a recess of 15 minutes. You could feel the bewilderment. Attorneys looked at each other incredulously. Rick attempted to go to the bench to continue advocating for Teresa, but the judge waved him away. "We're in recess," I responded, "Counselor," she said. Judge Hesington got up quickly and strode back to her room, with the clerk at her heels. Nobody in the courtroom understood what had just transpired or the reason behind the judge's sudden termination of the hearing. Rick appeared as perplexed as the opposing lawyer, who had just moments before exuded a sense of smug satisfaction. The pieces didn't start to fit together until the clerk stealthily entered the hallway and saw Sergeant Harrington. Although a little more stressful than normal, Harrington's day had been typical. He was intrigued by the sudden silence. The clerk added, "The judge needs you in her chambers right now, Sergeant." Harrington's brows went up. The judge's summons of a court security guard outside of a disciplinary case was rare. He quickly turned and trailed behind the cashier. Hesington was on the phone in the judge's chambers, with its dark oak furnishings and shelves full of heavy legal books. Her tone was submissive, her stance stiff. "Yes," she said to the person on the other end of the line, "Mr. Secretary." "I get it. Yes, I will take care of it right now." Harrington took over and stood at attention after she looked at him. Her face was serious. Judge Hesington stopped the call after a few more courteous yes sirs and stern nods. Carefully, as though it were a burden she could barely handle, she put the receiver down. Hesington remarked softly, looking directly into Harrington's eyes, That was the White House. It appears that the administration has taken notice of Theresa Marshall's case. A high-ranking official wants to make sure her testimony isn't interrupted. Sergeant Harrington's jaw dropped in shock. The White House? Although he had read about the administration's recent efforts to increase scrutiny of discriminatory practices, he never imagined that they would extend to one Shady Grove courthouse. The judge went on, her voice faltering a little. This changes things. You must locate Miss Marshall right away and bring her back into the courtroom. If necessary, uncuff her. Take whatever necessary action. We must afford her every civility and restart the hearing as quickly as feasible. Harrington blinked as he remembered Teresa's reserved dignity, the annoyance in her gaze, and how he had held her arm only moments before. He was now being told to escort her back rather than out. He was aware of the irony. Not knowing how else to reply, he responded, "Yes, Your Honor." Taking a hefty file from her desk, Judge Harrington turned the pages. "I'm not sure what you heard, Sergeant, but please don't discuss this." The Department of Justice's secretary called and stated that the administration is interested in Miss Marshall's case. They were very clear that if Miss Marshall's right to a fair hearing was violated, there would be repercussions. Harrington took a deep breath. He had never experienced a routine operation like this. He managed to mutter, "I'll bring her back, Your Honor," and turned to leave. The unexpected whiplash made his mind spin. He was escorting Teresa out of the courtroom 1 minute while threatening to hold her in contempt. The following, he was directly ordered by the White House to make sure she was treated fairly. No one had predicted the ways in which the wheels of power were spinning. Sergeant Harrington hurried down the hallway, looking around for Teresa. Families were anxiously awaiting updates, and the usual courthouse commotion was in full force, with attorneys conversing in the corners. When he did see her, she was resting against a wall, tears streaming down her cheeks, close to the exit sign. When she saw him coming, she tensed up. Her face was reserved, probably anticipating more abuse. Teresa opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Harrington held up a hand that looked almost like an olive branch. He said, "Miss Marshall," in a somewhat softer tone than before. "You are asked to return to the courtroom." Teresa clutched her papers tighter, blinking in shock. "By whom?" she inquired. She was aware of the judge's previous rage. Harrington looked around anxiously before responding. "By the judge. Something new has come to light." Suspecting a trap or some bureaucratic ruse, she scrutinized him. "Why the abrupt change?" He answered honestly, but he didn't bring up the White House call. "I can't say. However, the judge particularly wants you back at the upcoming hearing." Teresa looked down at her phone, which was still silent, and then at the elevator. She pondered whether a miracle had taken place or whether Rick had been able to turn things around. She recalled an old saying of her mother's: "Justice can sometimes be found in unexpected places." Teresa chose to follow her gut when she noticed Harrington's abrupt change in attitude. She nodded curtly, still cautious. "All right, let's leave." They strolled down the hallway side by side, but their relationship was forever altered. At this unexpected situation, those who had earlier watched Harrington march Teresa out stared in disbelief. Some had heard about Teresa from previous announcements or from her discrimination complaint in the local press. Already, there were rumors that something exceptional had happened. They could feel the tension in the courtroom when they got there. Teresa and Harrington caught the attention of clerks, lawyers, and the tiny crowd. Judge Harrington was already seated and rummaging through documents with a stern look on his face. With a look of relief and interest on his face, Rick Stanton stood at the plaintiff's table. As though caught off guard, the opposing counsel looked both bewildered and uneasy. Harrington, the judge, cleared her throat. She motioned to the plaintiff's table and said, "Miss Marshall, please take your seat." Her tone had lost its sharpness. A tense civility took its place. "You may now provide any additional evidence that is pertinent to the case, Mr. Stanton." The abrupt about-face startled Rick, and he opened his mouth. But he bounced back fast and motioned for Teresa to sit next to him. With her heart racing, Teresa took a step forward, aware that everyone in the room was staring at her. This was quite different from being told to leave minutes earlier. When everyone was comfortable, Rick leaned down and muttered, "What the hell happened?" "I have no idea," Teresa murmured back. "But let's make the most of it." The judge gave them both a look. "Counsel, you can go on." This marked the start of the second act of a hearing that was now being monitored by a power that was located far outside the courthouse. Once more, the prospect of true justice flickered, and this unexpected opportunity to finally be heard made Teresa's heart skip a beat. Rick Stanton brought the fresh batch of emails into evidence with a newfound resolve. Unquestionably racist statements were shown on the above displays. The managers of the marketing business appeared to single Teresa out by mentioning her urban style or using coded language such as "she might not be a fit for our clients." Her bonuses were decreased without any explanation, while her less qualified co-workers were promoted, according to one chain of letters. The courtroom was taken aback by the discovery. Even the previously unconcerned Judge Harrington looked disturbed by the obvious bias exposed. Sputtered, the opposing counsel attempted to raise issues of authenticity and relevancy. But Rick calmly outlined these emails' digital route, including metadata. As everyone in the courtroom watched the sequence of discriminatory acts play out, the anxiety increased. Teresa was in the strange position of having people in positions of responsibility take the time to listen to what she had to say. Before speaking, she took a deep breath to regain her composure. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice a little shaky. "It concerns every worker who has experienced discrimination, underpayment, or disregard due to their race. What I've been claiming all along is supported by these emails. They exhibit a pattern of prejudice, and if no one challenges it, the pattern will persist." There was a deep silence in the room. Even the opposing lawyer, who had before exuded a smug attitude, leaned back in his chair. He seems to understand that he was in a tight spot and that these emails were more than a small annoyance. They were a possible bombshell that might have major legal ramifications that went beyond Teresa's particular situation. Rick carefully explained the background of each email throughout the course of the following hour. Additionally, he offered the testimony of two of Teresa's former co-workers who had discreetly filed affidavits detailing comparable situations. Despite their fear of reprisals, those co-workers' statements supported Teresa's allegations and validated a pattern of black employees being marginalized. Teresa resisted a whirlpool of feelings, including relief, fury, fatigue, and vindication. She had been planning for this for months, but she never anticipated such a drastic change in circumstances. She gave Sergeant Harrington, who was hovering close to the rear of the courtroom, a single glance. For a moment, their gazes locked. He appeared different now, as if he had come to terms with the fact that he had, even if unintentionally, taken part in something deeply unfair before. Despite her austere demeanor, Judge Harrington appeared to be taking this evidence much more seriously than before based on her repeated notes and grave nods. She paused to think in silence after the last email was shown. She then looked at the defense attorney. "Do you currently have any rebuttals?" The defense attorney got to his feet, shoulders clearly tense. With a tremble creeping into his normally assured voice, he continued, "Your Honor, we asked for a brief recess to review these materials." Harrington's eyes shifted from Teresa to the defense attorney. "Okay, 30 minutes. Let's get together right now. We have a lot to talk about." As she delicately struck the gavel, everyone in the room let out a collective sigh. Teresa sagged in her chair, her body battling adrenaline and relief. Rick touched her hand as he reached over. "Hold on, we got them on the ropes." Teresa's phone buzzed softly as the lawyers started to assemble their materials for the interval. When she took it out, she saw a friend's message. "Your case is making headlines, so turn on the television." Something about the White House calling. Teresa's gaze expanded. She had the impression that she had been transported to an other reality. She was simply a regular citizen looking for justice this morning. She was now in the middle of a national storm, feeling both hopeful and uncertain. There was a lot of speculation in the courthouse hallways during the recess. Despite the lack of clarity, word quickly spread that the White House was involved. According to some, the judge was threatened with an investigation if she didn't give Teresa a fair chance. Others muttered that a senior official had personally insisted on an impartial hearing. Although no one could verify it, The more bizarre stories claimed that the president himself was on the phone telling the judge to act morally. Rick and Teresa hid in a peaceful nook close to the vending machines. They needed time to regroup and make plans. In order to confirm that the news had truly reached a national audience, Rick texted a few journalist connections. Teresa's recently found evidence appeared to have been leaked to news organizations, and the administration had taken notice of the extreme discrimination. Looking at the reporter texts, Rick said, "This is a game changer." They claimed that this might provide a standard for the enforcement of federal anti-discrimination laws. Teresa felt her heart race. This kind of attention is not what I ever wanted. Rick smiled at her sympathetically. If we play our cards well, you might be able to help fix a flawed system. Sometimes you find yourself in the spotlight. She looked down, remembering Ava at home. Social media was already on fire. Teresa was concerned that her daughter would read offensive or private remarks. However, Teresa was willing to pay the price if it meant exposing injustice. They were both startled by a voice behind them. "Pardon me," Sergeant Harrington said. The stiffness in his stance had lessened as he stood a few steps away with his hands by his sides. With caution, Teresa turned. He cleared his throat. "Indeed, I had something to say." Rick glanced at Teresa, prepared to step in if needed. Harrington gestured placatingly with a raised palm. "I simply want to say I'm sorry. Although I was carrying out my duties, I now understand how it felt and appeared to you. I apologize for removing you in that manner." Teresa examined him, looking for sincerity in his gaze. She observed a complex mix of remorse and unease, but no malice. Under her breath, she whispered, "I accept your apology. However, it doesn't reverse the course of events." Harrington nodded curtly. "I just wanted you to know I know. I wish you luck there." He started to leave but paused. "I didn't think they would truly listen to you, if that's any comfort. However, it appears that you have some influential people on your side." Teresa remained silent. She saw him withdraw along the hallway, a feeling of emotional agony trailing after him. Rick touched her shoulder in a comforting manner. "People can change, or at least admit when they're wrong, as I mentioned. All right, let's just concentrate on the hearing." She gave a nod. The following session's countdown started. Even though they only had a few minutes to finish their arguments, the unexpected surge of media attention and high-level backing felt like a sea change. Teresa felt the prospect of a real triumph for the first time in months. In contrast, the remainder of the proceedings felt nearly anticlimactic. The defense attempted to defend their stance by arguing that their client's general policy was inclusive and that the emails were not indicative. But the harm was already done. A separate hearing was set by Judge Harrington to decide on damages and potential injunctive relief. The liaison for the Department of Justice, meantime, asked that all documents be sent in for possible federal examination. Teresa sank back in her seat, exhausted both emotionally and physically, as the gavel finally fell, announcing that the session was adjourned. With a smile on his face, Rick gave her a brief embrace of congratulations. Even though he knew the legal battle was far from done, he muttered, "We did it." Reporters with cameras and microphones crowded outside the courthouse. Due in part to the alleged phone call from the White House, the matter had become quite well known. Unaccustomed to the spotlight, Teresa made an effort to maintain her composure. Rick led her through the throng while making remarks about how this was a civil rights win and a warning to businesses that continued to engage in discriminatory practices. Teresa's voice could be heard over the cameras as she responded to a few queries. "All I want is justice. Not just for me, but for every one person who is subjected to discrimination. I'm hoping this will inspire others to speak up." Her remarks immediately spread to national broadcasts after reverberating through local news networks. Social media was inundated with people condemning her previous company and expressing support for Teresa as they shared their own experiences of workplace discrimination. However, the marketing company hurried to control the damage behind the scenes by declaring that they would launch an internal investigation and that they do not allow prejudice. As customer confidence waned, their stock started to decline. Class action lawsuits appeared feasible, if not probable. In order to give Teresa a brief period of tranquility, Rick escorted her into a conference room about the middle of the afternoon and softly shut the door behind them. "Are you okay?" he inquired. She laughed unsteadily. "I don't know. It's been an incredible day." Was the court really forced to allow me to speak after a DOJ observer showed up and the White House called? Rick smiled, pride gleaming in his eyes. "Indeed, we did. Well done. In this courthouse and perhaps elsewhere, you have created history." Teresa collapsed into a chair as fatigue overcame her. Thinking of Ava and the months of tension that had brought her to this point, she scratched her temples. A mixture of lingering incredulity and thankfulness. Teresa had a startling realization at that same time. The smallest spark, such as a timely phone call or a piece of leak proof, can tip the scales even when it looks like a system is rigged and people in power are unchangeable. Her optimism returned. She and innumerable other people who were subjected to bigotry were not alone in their quest for justice. Sergeant Kyle Harrington paced the silent hallways, closing up. Later that night, after the courts had cleared out, his co-workers were gone, and the normal commotion of daily traffic had given way to silence. The building's age and the innumerable stories that were told in its rooms were revealed by the gently flickering ceiling lights. Harrington stopped close to courtroom 306, recalling the prior scene. He had never felt so directly implicated, nor had he ever witnessed such a sudden reversal. There was a change in him. Maybe it was the sobering effect of the White House's intervention, or the genuine faith in Teresa's eyes. He pulled out a little notepad and turned the pages, writing down his notes for the day. Security inspections, entry and exit times, and the incident report regarding Teresa's expulsion. The guilt weighed more heavily on his shoulders the more he considered it. He remembered Teresa's expression when he took her arm. She had not resisted. All she wanted was to be heard. He felt a surge of unease. Upholding the law was something he had always taken pride in. He had, however, become involved in the silence of a black lady who was merely defending her rights at that same moment. Harrington slipped the notebook back into his pocket and continued walking past the judge's chambers toward the exit. He could see the dim glow of a bulb through the frosted glass of the closed door. Maybe the judge was still in there, still processing what had happened that day. Harrington took a deep breath as he pulled open the large courthouse doors and stepped out into the cool evening air. He felt more reflective than he had in years as he gazed at the sunset's purple-orange hues. He was startled out of his thoughts by a startling vibration from his phone. His wife had texted him, "Are you all right? Everything concerning White House involvement in the courthouse case is in the news." He typed a quick response back. "It's a busy day, but I'm fine. When I go home, let's speak." After that, he walked over to his car and shoved his phone in his pocket. He had a lot on his mind. Perhaps he owed Teresa more than just an apology. Perhaps he might have done more in his position to prevent such injustices from occurring during his tenure. Sometimes it only takes one action or one epiphany to start a change. Harrington couldn't get rid of the sensation that he had reached a turning point in his life as he drove home. He was no longer able to maintain his impartiality or claim ignorance. He had joined a larger narrative that required moral bravery, whether he liked it or not. Tension of its own vibrated through the halls of power in Washington, D.C. Reporters were eager to jump on the morning's hot themes when White House Press Secretary Linda King entered the daily briefing room. The heat from the television lights was resisted by the air conditioner, and when Linda stepped up to the podium, the clamor of eager voices subsided. "Good morning," she said, looking around the gathering. "I'll now take your inquiries." Hands went up, and Linda gestured to an Associated Press reporter. "Is it accurate to say that a White House official directly intervened in a local Maryland court case over suspected anti-Semitism?" In reference to Teresa's tale, the reporter inquired. Linda maintained a deliberately neutral expression. Ensuring the protection of civil rights throughout the country is a top priority for the administration, including the Department of Justice. I can tell you that the federal government has the power to look into possible civil rights law infractions, even at the local level, even though I am unable to comment on individual phone conversations or correspondence. There was a clamor of follow-up inquiries. Are you confirming or denying that the White House directly contacted a judge regarding Theresa Marshall's case? A second CNN reporter pressed. Linda hesitated, picking her words carefully. I can only state that Ms. Marshall's circumstances have been communicated to the administration, and we take seriously any reasonable claims of discrimination. The Department of Justice is tasked for monitoring and guaranteeing adherence to federal anti-discrimination legislation. It wasn't a denial, exactly. The room was alive with conjecture. Then Linda changed the subject, but the seed had been sown. Indeed, there had been high-level involvement of some kind. "We're getting hammered on that Theresa Marshall question," a staffer confided to Linda later in a quiet hallway away from the reporters. Linda gave a curt nod. She knew it could be controversial to publicly recognize direct judicial influence. However, an administration that had run on a platform of social justice could not afford to ignore outright discrimination. Somewhere in the background, a Civil Rights Division employee had realized how important Teresa's case was. They might have been connected to an advocacy group that shared the fresh data. It wasn't crazy for an administration that was especially sensitive to racial justice concerns to take up the phone and make sure due process wasn't violated. There was a sense of relief that Linda King felt when she returned to her workplace. Although the public may question whether the White House should get involved, she believed that a discrimination case should not be left unchecked. The government appeared prepared to accept the political dangers that occasionally accompanied moral decisions. Executives from the marketing company at the heart of Teresa's case called an urgent meeting in a modern boardroom with a view of downtown Baltimore. The fluorescent lights shone on the polished mahogany table, but the atmosphere was anything but cheerful. On his tablet, the CEO, a silver-haired man with weary eyes, scrolled through a flurry of unfavorable news. His voice reverberated in the quiet room as he whispered, "This has gotten out of control. This morning, our stock fell 3 more points." A vice president of marketing cleared her throat. A media statement highlighting our dedication to diversity and inclusion has been produced. Additionally, we're starting an internal inquiry. The lawyer for the company, who was seated at the far end of the table, scoffing low. That might not be sufficient. As he adjusted his glasses, he spoke. "We could be vulnerable to a class action lawsuit in this situation. We're vulnerable on all fronts, especially with the Department of Justice investigating." The CEO rubbed his temples and scowled. "How about reaching a settlement with Miss Marshall outside of court? Is it possible for us to discreetly end this?" The lawyer gave a shrug. "Perhaps, but given all the media attention, she appears committed to seeing this through. Along with a formal apology and a sizable payment, we would also need to show that our business structure has actually changed." An additional executive spoke up. "The workers who are protesting on social media that they experience the same prejudice must also be taken into account. This may not be an isolated incident. We'll have to defend ourselves against a dozen lawsuits if we're not careful." The tension increased. The corporation had been able to get away with subtle biases for years, denying promotions to some employees and more easily blaming them for failures than their white counterparts. The majority of senior managers never questioned the system since it was so ingrained. Under the attention that Teresa's lawsuit had brought, the entire structure was now crumbling. A pen rolled off the table when the CEO pounded his palm against it. "Damage control is urgently needed. Just repair this, offer her a compensation, and if necessary, make adjustments." He was unaware that a fresh group of workers had already begun writing their own grievances. They had been inspired to come forward by Teresa's bravery and the spectacular court proceedings. The company was about to undergo a radical change. Teresa discovered surprising people supporting her as negotiations started behind the scenes. One was Melanie Cruz, a Latina woman who had previously worked as an intern for Teresa at the marketing company. She sent Rick Stanton an email outlining her observations of supervisors demeaning Teresa. Melanie remarked, "She was the best mentor I ever had, yet they never acknowledged her efforts. Rather, they made fun of her concepts." Melanie put her own professional future at stake by offering to testify, if necessary. An unexpected ally, a current manager at the company, stated that she was fed up with the negativity and was prepared to voice her opinions, even if they were anonymous. With signs that read, "Equal work, equal respect," local civil rights organizations staged a tiny demonstration outside the courthouse in the meanwhile. "We stand with Theresa Marshall," said a speaker from the local NAACP chapter. "This is not a singular occurrence. Systemic unfairness is reflected in this, and it needs to be fixed." Rick took Teresa inside his small house and told her what had happened. A settlement is being alluded to by the company's attorneys. Additionally, they're discussing an apology, but it may be more for public relations purposes. Teresa's thoughts were racing. She wanted to settle part of her. She was worn out and struggling financially. Another portion, however, pushed her to wait until genuine responsibility was guaranteed. What if we advocate for structural adjustments to stop this from happening again, such as new regulations or a required diversity audit? She pondered out loud. Rick gave a contemplative nod. We can certainly include that in the discussion. The company is defending itself. We are in a position of power. Teresa felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. However, what if they accuse me of misconduct and want to drag me through the mud? Rick smiled comfortingly at her. We have proof. Furthermore, the White House's involvement is significant. They won't take the chance of seeming worse in front of the public. She sighed. None of this attention is what I ever wanted. However, it might be worthwhile if we can assist in repairing this flawed system. At that moment, Teresa received an SMS on her phone. You're popular again, Mom. The victory of #Teresa is going viral. It was Ava, posting with excitement the most recent round of social media messages that praised Teresa's courage. Teresa thought it was a stretch to say that she was a modern-day Rosa Parks. She was unable to ignore the fact that her case had become a flashpoint and that a significant change was occurring in the cultural landscape. Even the mayor of the city expressed support on Twitter, stating that her office will work with nearby companies to examine employment procedures. Teresa was astounded by how one person's struggle might spark a wave of social and corporate scrutiny. Startling information came to light as the company's internal inquiry went on. The manager who had been in charge of Teresa's section found out to have a history of using offensive language. He had also falsified other minority employees' performance reviews. Numerous concerns that were either quietly dismissed or never thoroughly examined were found in HR records. Both the management and the company's reputation were doomed by these discoveries. He had previously acted with almost complete impunity, but the increasing attention compelled the executives to respond quickly and forcefully. Just as Teresa had once been escorted out of the courtroom, he was fired within days and escorted out of the premises. Employees were not blind to the irony, whispering that karma had returned full circle. He was furious as the manager, escorted by security, packed his things in a cardboard box. However, the majority of the population was against him. He was called a textbook bigot on social media, and demands for more accountability grew. Even a report on his history of racist behavior was broadcast by the local news. The CEO, meantime, was also subject to criticism. A group of significant investors threatened to pull out unless the corporation implemented a top-down review and removed important leadership people in response to demands from shareholders for explanations. The board had many emergency sessions as a result of the meltdown. After years of covert racism, the once secure corporate power players were put on the defense in a matter of weeks. When Teresa initially filed her complaint, no one anticipated this harsh retribution. Those who believed they could avoid accountability indefinitely were being punished by the system. Teresa sat across from a group of the firm's attorneys in a well-appointed conference room. The Department of Justice liaison watched via video call, and Rick Stanton was by her side. In earnest, the settlement talks had started. The chief lawyer for the firm cleared her throat. We're willing to pay Ms. Marshall's whole legal bill in addition to making a sizable financial settlement offer. Rick and Teresa looked at each other. He questioned, what about institutional reforms? The lawyer's lips were pursed. We can commit to updating training programs and doing a diversity audit. Additionally, a formal apology is being drafted. Teresa bent over. How can we be certain that this isn't merely lip service? We require accountability mechanisms such as third-party supervised quarterly reports on hiring and promotion procedures. The lawyer's expression tensed. That's pretty wide. Speaking up from the screen was the DOJ liaison. Maybe not. External inspection may be necessary to guarantee adherence to federal standards, considering the seriousness of the evidence. The room became really tense. The legal staff of the firm took notes while conferring in low voices. Teresa's heart was racing, but she maintained a steady stare. Her career and the destinies of many of the firm's remaining employees could be shaped at this very moment. The lead lawyer returned with a revised proposal after a short break. A multi-million-dollar compensation, required leadership changes, at least 2 years of third-party supervision, and an official apology admitting discrimination had taken place were all part of it. Teresa started crying as she and Rick went over the written draft. They were providing more than she could have ever imagined. However, it still felt passive and uncommittal to use the apology language. Expressions such as unfortunate events and inadvertent prejudice. Teresa pushed for a clear admission of fault and insisted on more forceful wording. The company's attorneys initially objected, but reluctantly gave in under the threat of public scrutiny and the DOJ. Teresa reached a historic settlement agreement at the conclusion of the protracted negotiation process, which required structural reforms within the firm in addition to compensating her. She felt a rush of relief and victory when the last signature was scrawled. She felt that her case was lost when she thought of the time in the courtroom when Sergeant Harrington had marched her out. She was now in possession of a legal document that represented a real advancement in justice. This remarkable result was the result of the White House's cooperation, the media's attention, and her own unwavering determination. Headlines were dominated by the settlement when it was announced. The majority of the stories focused on the company's forced, unprecedented restructuring. Some referred to it as a wake-up call, while others termed it a historic win. Teresa was flooded with demands for interviews. She made the decision to publish her tale sparingly, concentrating on publications that would provide genuine understanding of systemic discrimination instead of those looking for dramatic publicity. Sergeant Harrington contacted Teresa during the festivities to ask if they might meet. At first, she was apprehensive, but Rick persuaded her to listen. After all, their courtroom meeting had come to represent a turning point in the abuse of power. They decided to get together at a tiny cafe close to the courthouse. Harrington showed they're dressed simply, almost like a sheep. He poured out his regrets over coffee. He responded quietly, "I know my apology doesn't change what happened that day. However, I would like to inform you that I have requested a transfer to the Community Relations Unit. I'd like to perform better." Teresa took a time to examine him. With cautious word choice, she answered, "Thank you for saying that. Thank you for getting in touch. I now know that this system is more extensive than a single judge or police officer. We can all do our share to change it." With a look of relief in his eyes, Harrington nodded. For several more minutes, they discussed the courthouse's ongoing renovations, a new sensitivity training program, and rules to prevent racial bias in court orders, including rules for law enforcement personnel in courtrooms. Teresa experienced a sense of relief as they said goodbye. In a traditional sense, it was not forgiveness. It was more of an acknowledgement that atonement was possible and that people could change. Even if it began with challenging talks like these, she felt that closing these gaps was necessary for real change. As a formality to document the settlement, Teresa and Rick ascended the courthouse steps once more a week later for a final hearing. Although it has diminished, the media was still there. With posters that read, "Thank you, Teresa," a few supporters encouraged her. Judge Harrington nodded a subdued greeting to her inside. Following the dispute, the judge appeared more circumspect, but her eyes also held a glimmer of respect. Weeks before, Harrington had fired this same woman. Teresa was now known across the country for her efforts to combat injustice. The hearing didn't last long. The judge inquired as to whether the conditions of the settlement had been accepted by both parties. In response, the defense attorney said, "Yes. Your Honor, we are happy with the terms," said Rick. Teresa caught Judge Harrington's attention. "Do you think your issues are sufficiently addressed by this settlement, Ms. Marshall?" Teresa took a deep breath as memories came flooding back. Her forcible removal, her frustrated tears, the ray of hope, and the uncontrollable series of events that culminated in a White House call. "Your Honor," she said, "it's a step in the direction of true justice, in my opinion." The courtroom echoed with a quiet whisper. Harrington gave a serious nod. Then, "Everything is in order." After she struck the gavel once, the case that had taken up Teresa's life abruptly ended. Teresa remained straightforward in her comments despite the barrage of questions from reporters outside. I'm glad the truth was out at last, and I hope it inspires others to come forward. This triumph is not solely for me. The struggle against discrimination is for everyone. She felt lighter than she had in months as she walked down the courtroom steps after her comments reverberated in the clear air. This was not only an individual triumph. It was evidence of the value of allies, the strength of tenacity, and the various ways that justice could be carried out. Teresa's life kind of got back to normal in the weeks that followed, but it was eternally altered. People who were moved by her bravery sent her innumerable messages. In order to make sure her daughter realized the importance of what had happened, she also spent more time with Ava. The marketing company started putting the settlement's guidelines into practice. Increased openness in hiring and promotion procedures was evident in early reports. To make sure that compliance was maintained, an impartial watchdog was chosen. Workers came forward feeling more hopeful. For her part, Teresa made the decision to launch a small consulting business that counsels businesses on creating truly inclusive workplaces. She established a structure to provide auditing, workshops, and training with Rick's assistants. She received advice from former classmates, co-workers, and even staff members of her previous marketing company. Teresa got an official letter from the Department of Justice one rainy afternoon as she was going over some papers at her kitchen table. She discovered a high-ranking official's signed recognition for her part in exposing widespread discrimination inside. The letter congratulated her for bringing justice and equity to workplaces around the country. As Teresa read, tears filled her eyes. This recognition seemed unreal. She recalled the silent fear of the courtroom corridor and the burning humiliation of being taken out. All of this now appeared to be a part of a bigger picture, a trip that demonstrated that even the most established structures may be overthrown. A sliver of sunlight broke through the rain clouds outside. Overlooking the neighborhood was a rainbow arch. Seeing it as a sign of hope, Teresa grinned. As a testament to her progress, she closed the letter and placed it gently on top of the settlement documents. This concludes the incredible story of a single voice that was first silenced before being elevated to the highest levels of authority in order to secure justice for herself and innumerable others who might not have otherwise been heard. We appreciate you coming along on this incredible trip with us. In a packed courtroom, Theresa Marshall's fight started as a single discrimination complaint. However, it blew up into a national sensation that shook business headquarters and even reached the White House. Teresa's tenacity and moral fortitude changed her life and the lives of innumerable others, from her forcible deportation by a doubtful police officer to Washington's pivotal intervention. She demonstrated to us that when you stick to the truth, things may change drastically. Please let us know if this tale changed your perspective on justice or inspired you. You can encourage real-world change and spread awareness of tales like Teresa's by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Press the subscribe button, turn on the alert, and tell your friends about this video. We can all benefit from a more equal future if we work together.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.